Right, good evening and welcome to another webinar by Technion Australia. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ori Danieli. I'm the CEO of Technion Australia, which is the representative arm of the Technion Israel's Institute of Technology. I want to take you back in time about, it's February 2020, and I'm sitting at a board meeting with our usual catch-up of the board. It's just going through just a general update of what we're up to and what we're going to do. And we have a couple of events planned, one at UTS and another one at a legal firm in the city. And then I hear a voice from one of the members of the board saying, hey, hold on a sec, we can't do that. And I'm going to raise my eyebrows and say, why not? This is part of our agenda to provide insight into what our scientists are working on and alumni. And this one individual happens to be our speaker today, is also on our board. His name is Michael Wallach, as you can see on the screen. And he explained there is a pandemic going on in the world, which is going to affect all of us. And it won't be a responsible act of us to get people together in a room. And we're thinking, okay. And then he went into a lot of detail. I'm reminding you, this is February 2020. Not a lot is known about the pandemic. And realizing that this is really a significant concern. And we made the decision as a board to postpone all physical face-to-face events. But then someone suggested the idea that perhaps we could have Michael present to our supporters and members just a little bit of insight, explanation about what is this thing called coronavirus and how is it going to impact our lives. So if you're interested, it's very interesting to see what Michael did in March 2020 when it was very early stages. And at those days, we were talking about 10,000 death cases globally and 200,000 cases of infectious. And then a couple of weeks later, we did Ask the Expert Take 2, again with Michael. And by then there was already 70,000 deaths and 440,000 cases. So you can see that it's growing. And fast forward to September 2021, and today it was recorded 4.7 million people already died from coronavirus and 228 million cases. So obviously, this has become a far greater incident than I think anyone would have predicted. In to Michael's credit, I guess, when we spoke to him in March 2020, he said, we have to be ready for this. It's going to take a while. This is something that's not going to just go away, and it's going to impact our life. So we're very privileged and honored to have Michael with us here today. Michael happens to live a double life. So he lives in Australia and in Israel. He's a teacher. He's a lecturer both in UTS and at the Technion. And Ruth, who is our moderator, will introduce him formally in a minute. And he can share some insight from what's happening in Israel, which I think, like Australia, everywhere in the world is looking at Israel, who has been sort of doing a lot of things early when it comes to coronavirus, to dealing with the pandemic. So on that note, it is my great privilege to welcome Dr. Ruth Ratner, who is the president of Technion Australia, and will moderate the conversation. Before I hand over, I'll just mention once again, this webinar is for you, our viewers, our listeners. Please ask questions. This is what Michael's here for. He's happy to take any questions. By now you would know how to use the system. There's a Q&A button, and Michael will do his best to answer. We're here till 8 o'clock, but if there's more questions, I know Michael has kindly offered to stick around. So Ruth, on that note, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Ori. In March last year, when we had our first webinar on COVID-19, our knowledge was scant, to say the least. 18 months is a long time, and there's been an explosion of information about the virus. Everybody now thinks they're an expert. Fortunately, Australia's been in the privileged position of watching how other countries have been impacted and how they've handled the virus. But I think the honeymoon is over, and we're now facing the reality of how we can learn to live with a deadly disease that's mutating faster than science can address it, and how we can do so without living in fear. With so many competing opinions on the best way forward, we're fortunate to again be able to call on Professor Michael Wallach to explain some of the issues of vaccinations, herd immunity, and potential treatments. Professor Wallach is an adjunct professor at UTS and at Technion, and has spent most of his working life researching viruses and parasitic infections in humans and in animals. Michael, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and it's a pleasure to be here. And as you rightly said, I'm happy to stay as long as people want to ask questions. And I'm always happy to ask questions, even when the webinar ends. So I'd like to firstly talk a little bit about my own work and where I'm heading and how it will relate to the problem of COVID. My work over the years has been in developing prophylactic approaches to infectious diseases, where the concept is rather than to try and eradicate and greatly reduce infection, it's rather learning to adapt to infections. And in this case for COVID, I'm leading a project to develop tablets that contain antibodies from egg yolk of hens immunized with the spike protein of COVID-19, and to apply them in the human setting to reduce the transmission and number of cases and infections that we see today. So with that in mind, I'll just go forward. And first of all, I want to make sure I put everyone on the same page. So I'll share my screen for a moment. This table contains the latest statistics that describe the current situation that I found on the site Worldometer that many of you probably follow. So it's just to make sure we are all on the same page. And as you can see, I'm looking at the situation today in Israel, Australia, the United States, the UK, and in the world. As was already mentioned, in the world, there are currently 228 million cases with 4.7 million deaths. And in Israel, there's about 1.2 million cases with 7,000 deaths. Where in contrast, in Australia, there are only 82,000 cases and 1,141 deaths, which is a wonderful accomplishment thus far. And the United States is running at 688,000 deaths, and the UK 134,000. The rate of vaccination is, in fact, where Australia suffers the most, as you all know. Where only 36.4% of the total population of Australia has been vaccinated versus 64% in Israel, and similar numbers in the UK, and slightly lower in the US. Israel has vaccinated down to the age of 12, where over 78% of that population has been vaccinated. So the outlier in terms of vaccination remains Australia. And Australia started late, and in fact is taking a long time to be able to vaccinate a large proportion of the population. To move down and not spend too much time on this chart, another interesting feature in Israel versus other countries is the number of young children under 14 years old, which is 27%, and compared to the rest of the world, it's extremely high. And in fact, the rate in which childbirths occur in Israel is the highest in the OECD. The other final thing I'll point out that I think is important is the death rate, where in Israel it's running at 0.6% of the number of cases and in death, versus higher numbers in other countries and in the world, which probably attests to the role that the vaccine has played thus far in lowering the number of deaths in this country. And finally, the number of deaths per million people in the population, also in Israel, is very low, and in Australia, extremely low, mainly because of all the lockdowns that have occurred over the past year and a half. Now, to put that into perspective, tuberculosis is another very important infectious disease that has killed 1 billion people over the past 200 years and is still going strong, having killed 1.5 million people in 2019, mainly in developing countries, but also in countries like India and Russia and other countries. HIV has killed 40 million people. This isn't a very happy subject. Stroke and heart disease killed 21 million people in 2020, and COVID 3.5 million. So it gives you a perspective on the effect of this pandemic. And finally, just a slide to show that the trend is towards younger people getting infected with the virus in Israel. And in fact, 50% of the cases now in the current wave with Delta virus are in young children and teenagers below the age of 19. So I'll stop the share. Now, I always say to students when I teach in a course, and quote Einstein, who says, if you want to solve a problem, you must, and you have an hour to do so, you should spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes on the solution. And the main problem with COVID is that over time, waves, which I can show on the attached document. This shows the waves that we've experienced so far with COVID over the past year and a half in the world. And as you can see, there've been a series of 5 waves, starting from a relatively low one and building to higher and higher waves, both in terms of number of cases and in terms of mortality. And my wife and I go to the beach most mornings, and I was thinking of the analogy of the waves in water when you're in the beach. And when I was a child, the first time I went into the water, a small wave could knock me down and I was very afraid of it. And then I got used to it. And then bigger waves would come. And it'd be harder for me to get over those waves. And it's similar in COVID. As these larger waves are coming with more cases and with higher levels of mortality, it's harder for the world to deal with them. And we saw with Delta, particularly in India, that was the case. Now, Australia took the approach of building barriers, almost like a barrier that they would put in the water to break the waves and prevent the virus from coming into the country. Extreme measures were taken, as particularly everyone knows, in Sydney, where lockdown has been as long as up to 3 months, and in Melbourne, over 200 days of lockdown. In spite of all that lockdown, these waves keep coming, and particularly now in Australia, after having a long, lengthy period of virtually no cases, Delta has broken through and is led to a very severe peak. Now, if we think again about the ocean and the analogy of waves in the ocean, the problem is, and the goal is, to maintain the waves at low levels such that rather than causing severe disease, and rather than causing a situation where the hospitals are overrun with patients, it actually acts to build herd immunity. And together with vaccination and other means, such as the antibodies that we put in tablets that I talked about earlier, we aim to control the height of the waves such that people in the water can easily deal with them and not feel overwhelmed by them. Now, occasionally what occurs in the ocean, either under the water or due to other effects, such as an earthquake, a tsunami can suddenly appear, and that would overwhelm everything. And one of the things that we have to be concerned with in this pandemic is that situation, which is analogous to one in which a new variant of COVID appears somewhere in the world that is completely resistant to the vaccine, that has high rates of transmission and high mortality, that can suddenly appear and overwhelm us and overwhelm our hospitals. And that is the situation we have to avoid. And I like that analogy because it gives you a feeling of what it's like when you're facing waves in the water to facing the waves that are currently affecting us now. One of the things that I've learned over the years working in infectious diseases is in veterinary medicine, we've been working and dealing with viruses like COVID, coronaviruses, that causes a disease in chickens called infectious bronchitis virus that causes that disease. There are similar diseases in cattle and sheep and pigs and other animals. And what's been going on in the veterinary field is that this battle has been going on for many years. In fact, with infectious bronchitis virus, it is now 80 years of battling this virus with vaccines and other means of control, and it still keeps coming back. We make vaccines, the virus mutates, and a new variant is created, and it's able to overcome the vaccine, and we start all over again. And in fact, to develop what's called herd immunity, it takes a long time, a whole variety of measures to control it. It requires natural exposure together with vaccination to achieve herd immunity. But herd immunity in both in influenza and in COVID is not perfect, and we have to learn to live with that fact. It is unlikely, and Pfizer and others are saying so, it is unlikely that we're going to find the perfect solution. And the reality is we do have to be prepared for a long battle with this virus. Now, the other thing I would say is in order to, as I say, reduce these peaks and these waves in infection, we have to continue with social distancing, wearing masks, using prophylactic measures such as the tablet to block the virus, mainly in the nose and in the oral cavity, as well as other oral and nasal approaches that can help reduce infection. And in fact, what's also important is that the level of exposure that people face with the virus is maintained at a low level, that again acts to create a natural immunity to the virus and enables people to build up herd immunity over time. I do believe in the end, herd immunity is the only way of getting out of this pandemic. And success, to me, looks like, going back into the water analogy, a calm day on the beach in Haifa, where there are low waves, not occurring very frequently, and giving people the time to adjust and deal with these waves as they come towards us, while accepting the fact, as we do when we deal with influenza, that there will be seasonal COVID and seasonal flu and other diseases that we're just going to have to learn to continue to adapt to and to deal with, without fear and without trepidation, as we again do with flu, and learning from all this the importance of improving our health, that we all have to make an effort now, which is probably the most important thing of all, to maintain good health, because our immune systems and our ability to resist infection and to not be so badly affected by it depends on good health. So with that in mind, and again, with a model of saying, don't depend only on vaccines. We did it in Israel. In the wave that occurred before this one, the vaccine was quickly used in Israel. The numbers came down very dramatically, and everyone thought, this is over, we can go back to normal life. And a few months later, in the summer, and reminding everyone, some of the biggest waves we've seen have occurred in the summer. It's not necessarily the winter. It came back very strongly. Israel is giving a third boost, but overusing the vaccines, and this is true in veterinary medicine, can actually at some point not work and actually be deleterious to the effect you want. At this point in time, we have no choice but to use the vaccines, the wonderful vaccines that were created to get us out of the current situation. But going forward, we have to all learn to adapt and live with the virus. There is no other way. And that adaptation will take time, but it will involve individual responsibility. It will be much more the use of rapid testing and home testing. And in fact, I'll get to the subject of children in a moment and try to finish in the next few minutes. In fact, with children today, the government and Ministry of Health is actually expecting parents to test their children at home and be aware constantly of when their children are infected, and also what is their immune status. Do they have antibodies? Do they have high antibody titers? And that in that way, we stratify and individualize the population to be able to cope with the pandemic while we maintain maximum security over the most vulnerable in the population. And that, to me, is the way forward. Now, to answer a bit on the question of COVID and children in Israel, the school year did open in Israel under a great deal of controversy. There are those who wanted to continue with lockdowns. There are those who felt we have to get away from lockdowns in Israel. And a decision was taken, yes, to open the schools, even during this holiday period when they would be only a few days at school, to bring children back to normal life. Because the biggest brunt of this pandemic has been on children. And I'm sure that's the feeling in Australia. Here, children have started school, then had to stop, then start and stop. In the beginning of the school year, in fact, there were 102,000 Israeli children put into quarantine because they've come in contact with cases of COVID, including my own grandchildren who had to go through a period of potential quarantine and constantly were under the stress of not knowing if they can go to school. I believe, again, by using these rapid tests, and they are very accurate and very good. I used it when I was in America, entering into an old age home. In 15 minutes, you have a result. It's about 97% accurate in most cases. And based on that, you can make decisions about children going to school, people entering old age homes, etc. Finally, I'll end with an optimistic note. We are facing a serious problem, but if we face it together, and if we use science as our means of deciding how we want to deal with this pandemic, we can bring it to a situation that is acceptable. Here in Israel, we live with the virus now. We know that there are 12,000, often 12,000 cases a day, and yet we go about our business. Rapid tests are now employed easily in Israel, and at the schools they're given out for free. We use masks, and it's not perfect, and people are still learning. We often see people with the mask under their chin or not covering their nose, and they're reminded all the time of that. But with time, we will learn. With time, we will learn to control this. With time, we have to accept the fact that life is not perfect, and new methods of control will be developed. There are a million groups working around the world, and I do believe we will achieve an outcome that is acceptable and livable. Taking into account, just by using masks, we've seen what's happened with influenza and the fast decrease in numbers with flu. We have to try harder with COVID, but it is doable.
Michael, we've got quite a lot of questions that have come up. Some of them, I think you can address a few of them at once.
Okay, before I start addressing questions, let me just say that from the Australian perspective, just my view is, and I can say this publicly, the lockdowns need to end. Lockdowns should be used as the last alternative. It's time to start coming, and certainly now with a high proportion of vaccines, we should start coming out of isolation. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Michael, we've got lots of questions. Could you briefly outline the difference between an antibody test and an antigen test?
Fine. So the word antigen refers to something that one's body sees as foreign. And it could be a protein, it could be a bacteria, in this case, it's a virus. So when we talk about antigen, we're talking about the virus because it's foreign to our body. And the test that's been developed, the rapid one, is to be able to detect proteins on the surface of the virus called the spike protein, which you've all seen endlessly, those spikes that come off the surface of the virus. That can easily be detected at a very high level of sensitivity. Now, the antibody test is to measure the amount of antibodies that are in your blood. And antibodies are proteins that the body makes against foreign invading pathogens, such as COVID, and every other type of pathogen or disease-causing organism. And the level of antibody in your blood gives an indication of, number one, where you're infected in the past, because there are many people who walk around infected that don't even know they are. So if you do that test and you do see antibody, you know you've been exposed. And it also reflects how strong your immune system is working and reacting to the virus. And finally, it gives you an idea of how long the immunity lasts. I should also mention that in Israel, formally, past 6 months after the second vaccination, you are considered unvaccinated because by then, most of the immunity has waned. And in order to get a green pass in Israel and be able to enter restaurants and other things that you've probably read about, you need to have a third boost. Otherwise, you're considered non-immune. So it's important to measure the amount of antibody in our blood. And over time, to understand what that level means in terms of how resistant you are to infection.
So just to be clear, that immunity that you're measuring, the antibodies, can come about either via a vaccination or by natural immunity that you've acquired with a clinical infection that we know about, or a subclinical infection that we didn't know about.
That's correct. And what's also been found in Israel is after an infection, people's immunity are actually as high or higher than one has with vaccination. So it plays an important role in developing herd immunity in this country.
So there are different ways to achieve herd immunity, is what you're saying.
Yes, you can achieve it either by being exposed to the virus or being vaccinated, and ideally both. In fact, in veterinary medicine, it's the routine practice that you mix a live virus exposure with a type of what we're doing now with COVID, a sort of a messenger RNA or that type of vaccine that just contains a piece of the virus. So the whole live virus will induce a whole set of immune responses, and the vaccine will induce its own set of immune responses. And together, that's the strongest immunity one can achieve.
Okay. And somebody has asked the question, won't increasing vaccination lead to a super strain?
Right. So there is the possibility that as you continue vaccinating with highly effective vaccines like from Pfizer, with 95% reduction in viral load or viral replication, that the virus will be put under strong pressure, selective pressure to mutate away from the vaccine. There is the possibility, if we overuse the vaccines, we can potentially cause the appearance of a virus that is extremely pathogenic, extremely deadly. Coronaviruses, both in veterinary practice and in humans, can give much, much higher levels of mortality than we're seeing now. As I showed in that table, we're running at about the 1 to 2% mortality rate in terms of numbers of cases. I believe it's actually lower than that because a lot of cases are not detected. But if a so-called supervirus or a virus variant that is both extremely transmissible and extremely causes high levels of mortality, that can be disastrous. We must make sure we avoid that. In order to do so, we have to both keep a watch on these variants all the time, which is going on around the world, and we have to vaccinate countries in Africa and other parts of the world that are currently non-vaccinated, and particularly in South Africa, where HIV is very prominent. Patients with HIV and COVID, according to my colleague in Durban, they have enormous rates of the production of new COVID variants. And these variants pose a threat to the world that they can suddenly come out from anywhere and take off like we've never seen anything before. And that's analogous again to that tsunami or tidal wave I was talking about in the ocean. So that is the situation we must make all efforts to avoid, and we must be smart. We've seen with other diseases like TB, Staph aureus, malaria, you overtreat, you respond can lead to a situation where you force mutation, and you can face a very bad situation as a result of that. So we have to be strategic in the use of our vaccines. We have to try our best to use our behavioral changes to control this pandemic. We're all in this together, and we cannot allow ourselves to walk around with a mask under our chin, or worse than that, with no mask at all, and think that things are just going to be okay, because they're not.
Is there any comment on the Scandinavian experience, the difference between Sweden's approach and its similar neighbors?
Yeah, so Sweden, as everyone knows, initially was very liberal in the sense that they did not force people to make any real change in their lifestyle other than to say, it's your responsibility to behave properly. Unfortunately, even in Sweden, which I've spent a lot of time in, people in general are not able to understand what that means. They don't have the experience of having worked in laboratories. When we work with viruses in a lab, we work under extremely sterile conditions with air filtration systems to avoid transmission. We now know that the virus can even transmit in aerosols. So if somebody runs by you and is jogging, they can transmit to you. So Sweden did not do well, and there was a high level of mortality. And then eventually Sweden had to go back to the methods used in other states in Europe. And now they're fully vaccinated and behaving much more along the lines of other countries.
Okay, there's so many questions here. I'm trying to put them all into one category. Long term, how does the vaccine affect our immune system?
If that question is relating to messenger RNA vaccines, which I presume it is, what is true is that the approval given by the FDA for the use of the messenger RNA vaccine had an element of risk associated with it. Pfizer did do the best they can to do a clinical trial with as many people as they can, but when you go from 30,000 people to 8 billion, it's a big jump. All indications so far are that this is an extremely safe vaccine, and that there's no indication right now of long-term effects. That's not to say that there could be an unknown long-term effect that nobody's seen. But in the best labs in the world that can study side effects and that can study the mechanism by which this vaccine works, there is no indication right now of a long-term problem. The only long-term problem and one should look out for it, is to ensure that the immune response doesn't go too high. And that's true with the virus. And let's not forget, the virus has long-term effects. And what the FDA has to do constantly is weigh the risk versus the benefit. Now, we can't, the anti-vaxxer group feels we should not vaccinate. If we don't vaccinate, what we've already experienced would have led to much, much higher levels of mortality. And the hospitals would have been overrun, similar to what we saw in the beginning in Italy, in India, and this would have been around the world, and in Peru. By the way, the worst COVID situation is in Peru because the health system in Peru was relatively weak even before the pandemic. So we must vaccinate, but we must use it strategically. We must not overuse it. And with the hope that it's as safe as it's been and has been and performed so far.
Could you just quickly outline the types of immunity that we're aiming for? There's not just antibody levels.
Correct. So here's the 2-minute course in immunology. So the immune system is divided into antibody-producing cells and what are called T cells, or cellular immunity versus what's called humoral immunity. So the humoral is pretty straightforward. It's antibodies that attach to the virus that either neutralize the virus directly, or cells that see the virus coated with antibody will destroy it. On the cellular immunity side, it's a very complex immunity that involves all sorts of different types of cells that have to work together to deal with the virus and prevent it from entering and infecting cells. And often, if it sees an infected cell, it will kill the whole cell in order to get rid of the virus. The other type of cell in immune response is called the memory cell, whose job is to remember the virus so that when you come in contact with it again, which is classical vaccine science, it will immediately be ready to react and engage the immune system before the virus overtakes your body. and the immune system is weakened by it. So it's sort of, it preps you in time before the virus actually reaches your body. All arms of the immune response are required to deal with an infection, and particularly COVID. And again, to go back to what we said, immunity induced by infection, together with immunity induced by vaccines, is the best because all arms of the immune system get activated and produce the most long-lasting immunity. We've already seen with Pfizer, with 2 vaccinations, it only lasted 6 months in Israel, and this is not long enough. We would like a measles-type vaccine that lasts your entire life and protects your entire life because it induces very strong memory cells, and measles can no longer infect a person in that situation.
There was some evidence that the flu vaccine also helped prevent COVID, along the lines of the fact that it raised your general immunity, the same way one rarely gets measles and mumps at the same time.
Is this a question from the audience or from you?
Me. Well,
you.
Sounds wacky
Okay.
enough to be mine.
Okay. Look, this is another highly complex area, which is the interaction of different disease-causing pathogens on the immune response. And it's a very complex area. It can work both ways. Immunity can be raised too high, and immunity can be raised too low. In fact, with pandemic flu, the deaths caused by, in the Spanish flu, were mainly caused by people's bodies overreacting to the virus. So one has to be careful. You can't say, oh, I want to get infected with flu, so I'm immune to COVID. Or I want to get infected by God knows what, so I'm immune to flu. You cannot count on that. You cannot count on that benefiting you. And sometimes the immune system reacts in unexpected ways. Right now, we're in a very good situation with flu. I would continue hoping that flu remains a low, to be in very low levels. We had virtually no mortality from flu in 2020, and it's looking that way in 2021. I'd rather see COVID on its own, continuing this way, and the masks worked. The reason masks aren't as effective with COVID as flu is COVID's ability to transmit is higher, and the R value, or the reproductive index for COVID, is higher, and that's why even the mask is not enough to prevent it from transmitting, but does appear to be enough for influenza, which is a wonderful result.
Okay, somebody wanted to ask if the vaccine, after you've had the virus, does the vaccine then nullify the immunity?
So as I said before, no, the vaccine together with exposure increases the immune response further. The question that one has to ask, and is being asked, if somebody recovers from an infection, do they need a boost? Do they need the vaccine? Now, the CDC officially and still recommends that everyone who's recovered from infection gets vaccinated. I would say that's a bit extreme, and I think it's based on the fact that we don't yet have enough evidence, which is currently actually being found in Israel, that in fact, we probably do not need to be vaccinated if we've been through a moderate or certainly severe case of COVID and have recovered. I'm not saying now I would, or advocating for reversing that decision, but rather I would, as I said, have an antibody-based test to see where you are immunologically, and hopefully in the future also a T or a cellular test to say whether or not you need this extra boost. I would not automatically be boosted, you know, according to when everyone else is being boosted, but rather at specific times when you really need it.
Somebody has asked about the effect of ventilation on reducing infection. I think that's pretty quickly answered.
Yes, we want to keep good ventilation. We want to keep social distancing. We want to avoid aerosols. We're going to have to stop hugging, even though I did hug my sister-in-law a moment ago, but we have to stop that practice. as much as possible. I know it's hard with family. And yeah, but ventilation is certainly a very important aspect. And getting onto closed buses and trains and planes, one has to be careful.
What's your guess as the ratio of test detected and clinical disease to totally unrecognized disease, asymptomatic? Any idea? In other words, how much asymptomatic disease is out there?
So in the early stages of the pandemic, epidemiologists and others from WHO felt there's probably 10 times more cases than we know about, particularly in children. So I would assume, and you know, just speaking to people from my own experience, in fact, I was visiting a friend yesterday who said she had the symptoms of COVID, but didn't go and get tested. They were very mild. And I think a lot of people in Israel who had very mild COVID, probably many of them never went to get tested, and we'll never know if they were infected. So most people thought maybe there's a 5 to 10-fold difference between what we register as cases to what the truth is. The most accurate statistic, the numbers in hospitals, the numbers of deaths, that's clear.
Okay, this one I think I can safely answer. Is it a good idea to deliberately expose people to the virus to get immunity? I think that's called survival of the fittest. And if you want to operate on that system, go for it.
Yeah, and let's not forget that this virus can linger for a long time and cause problems that can be neurological and can lead to long periods of tiredness and fatigue and other issues. So no, don't try to get infected. Don't do it on purpose because it's uncontrolled. What has to happen, as I'm saying, is we as a society have to maintain as much as possible low levels of transmission, very low levels of virus, so that if you do get infected, it's a relatively mild or asymptomatic infection. That is the goal.
So we've hinted at what we should do with children, whether they should go back to school or not go back to school. And if they do go back to school, should they be tested? And what should we do with that?
So yeah, I strongly believe in rapid testing and home testing. It's very accurate. We can do it with our children. Yes, the finger prick is not pleasant, but they'll have to learn to deal with that. There are in fact new tests being developed, one based on saliva. There's a breath test being developed, which will be very helpful, not only for COVID, but for TB and other pathogens. I think that will come online pretty soon. And we just have to constantly monitor the situation, allow our children to go to school. If we find our child has antigen and has virus, they must be kept at home, clearly. But we also need to know in real time, has your child been exposed? What is the level of antibody? With time, understanding what's the level of immunity, and then making the right decision for your child. But again, the effect of children not going to school, as all parents of young children know, on their mental health and their well-being has been severe. And if we weigh the risk versus the benefit, we have to continue sending our children to school. I've been working with Martin Tate at Masada, at the Masada School and giving advice there. And they've made all efforts to continue the school going. I think that is the right approach. And I believe that we can keep the schools open.
Okay, and babies, any particular comment on the risk to babies?
So with the Delta strain, the risk to babies has become higher. And there are cases, as we all know, of babies that get severely ill from COVID. Generally speaking, that age group has very mild or asymptomatic infections, but it is possible. There is an element of risk. So again, even with babies, it would be worthwhile doing rapid tests and determining if there's an infection and if there is immunity at that age as well. And currently there's clinical tests going on to vaccinate down to age 3, and hopefully that will also occur.
Okay, and somebody's asked, can children catch COVID at the playground? I think Australian evidence is that there's been very little infection in outdoor situations. So I guess they can, but there has been very little of it. Now, we've been asked a question about flying and quarantine. What do you think? I mean, it has been raised, if there's so much disease in the community and people are in lockdown, why are travelers still in hotel quarantine?
Okay, before I get to that one, I just want to correct, let me just correct something I said a moment ago on Masada. They are working on Zoom, so, but they hopefully will get back to the classroom, so I'll make that clear. In terms of the hotel quarantine in Australia, I do understand that during this period in Australia, up until Delta that is, there was the strategy of the government is to eradicate the virus. Eradication can only occur with total isolation and quarantine. You can't depend on people even to go on home quarantine. Now in New South Wales, ACT and in Victoria, there is now an acceptance or more of acceptance of the fact that we're going to have to adapt to living with the virus. And as we're all hearing, there is now a trial going on for home quarantine. There's no question that home quarantine, and include myself in this list, makes a big difference for people thinking of going back to Australia and avoid 2 weeks in a hotel, which is absolutely horrible. Here in Israel, it's home quarantine. It doesn't work perfectly. And there are people who go out even when they're supposed to be at home and don't follow exactly the rule. They've been very strict here, by the way. The police check on everyone. As far as I know, they checked on me to make sure everyone who's at home was supposed to be at home. I believe Australia now has to move to a home quarantine system to enable the country to open up. Its economy, in my opinion, not an economist, needs the country to open up, needs stranded Australians to be able to come home, and needs to start returning to a more normal existence. And again, accepting the fact there will be COVID in the community.
Okay. Is there long COVID in vaccinated patients? I'm not sure if that whether the question was whether the vaccine can cause a long COVID-like illness, or whether patients who've been vaccinated can get long COVID.
Look, the vaccine, the messenger RNA vaccines cannot cause any COVID-like symptoms. The vaccine contains messenger RNA for just the spike protein. It does not make a live virus, so it does not set up an infection.
Okay. And fertility?
Fertility with the vaccination, you're asking?
Yeah, I know that since I've had the vaccine, I haven't been fertile at all.
Me neither. I've heard anecdotal evidence that vaccination has had effect on women's cycles for my daughter. I have not heard or seen scientific evidence for that. If there is, then it's not something I know about, but I would hope, based on FDA approval of these vaccines, I would expect that there would be a minimal, if any, effect on fertility.
I think that the answer to a lot of these questions is we've got a lot of horizontal information. You know, a vast number of people with COVID, a vast number of people have been immunized, but we haven't got a vertical information over a long timeline. And
Correct.
I think in terms of how long will things last, how long will boosters last, and so on, this is just going to become evident when it becomes evident.
Yes.
There's another question about whether children's immune systems are so underdeveloped we shouldn't. Well, that's just the answer to all injections in children, they need to develop that immunity to
Yes.
whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, Hep B, triple antigens, the whole works.
Yes.
So I think this is just another one that we have.
The other thing I would add on immunity in very young children and babies is the value of maternal immunity and breastfeeding. The vaccinated mother or exposed mother can make a huge difference in protecting a baby against infection by COVID.
I think in Israel originally they were not vaccinating pregnant women. They were initially avoiding it until they saw there was some very bad outcomes, and they switched right round.
Yeah.
Michael,
go ahead.
Two questions, three probably. Yeah. Is there anything we can do to improve immunity generally? What are the other, do you want to comment on the real evidence-based treatments there are around? What other treatments are being touted? And your lozenges, if you want to go into that as well.
Okay. Again, the immune response is very complicated. Most people who haven't studied immunology think all you need to do is increase the immune response and it protects you against disease. The immune system is a balanced system and it must stay in balance. If it goes out of balance in one direction or the other, it leads to problems. Autoimmunity, for example, has become very, very common in Western society because the immune system goes out of whack and starts attacking your own cells. Similarly with viruses, similarly with antibodies. Sometimes the immune system works beautifully and it kills the virus. Sometimes it overreacts. And you end up with what's called the cytokine storm, which is when the immune system literally takes off and there's no control over it, and it overwhelms the body in a bad way. So there's no, in my opinion, there's no guaranteed way to boost your immune system that necessarily will benefit you. What's clear is it's important to be healthy. It's important, and obvious things. It's important to exercise. It's important not to smoke. It's important to take care of your weight. It's important to avoid overeating things that are bad for you. Those things will do probably more for your immune system than trying to take medications or herbal remedies that may help. But I think the most important thing is common sense and keeping yourself as healthy as you can. And perhaps one day, as more information is gathered, more immune modulating approaches will be used. But at this point in time, I haven't seen anything that's clear cut. Okay,
so evidence-based treatments, what's out there?
So I'll talk a bit about what we're doing, and as well as others. We've developed a tablet that contains antibodies from the egg yolk of hens that are immunized with the spike protein. It is currently in trials, and that work's done in collaboration with groups at Stanford, UC Davis, University of Washington and St. Louis, George Mason University, and others. The goal of that work is to take those antibodies and use them either as a nasal drop or as a tablet or lozenge to coat the mouth, the throat, the nose, the nasal pharynx, and the entire part of the body that essentially meets the virus for the first time. And in fact, most of the receptors for the virus are located in your nose and in the back of your throat. So we've been working together to produce these antibodies on a large scale, which we've done in the United States and now starting in Europe. And we're organizing to carry out a clinical study, hopefully in South Africa or in Taiwan or in other countries in the world that hopefully will be able to carry out the work. We have done together a phase 1 clinical trial on the nasal drop formulation in Australia, and it actually was on the news in Australia. And we're currently scaling up to be able to do this on a large scale. And this is part of the idea of using this approach together with other types of nasal spray formulations that will make the nose and the throat and the mouth hostile to the virus. So it can't take up residence in your nose and mouth and cannot therefore infect you, and reduce the level of virus so it's, again, doesn't cause disease. Similar work I had done and led in a project on influenza, and we got amazing results in an animal trial where 100% of animals that were given this antibody survived a lethal infection, whereas the controls 100% did not survive, proving that this concept can really work and protect people against disease. There are many more vaccine approaches that are being developed. Oral formulations of the messenger RNA vaccine, so it doesn't have to be taken as a jab. Formulations so that it can be stored at room temperature, and many other types of approaches. There are also work going on in developing new drugs against COVID, and there's encouraging results coming out of Australia, I think Queensland. But what I can say in regards to drugs is that my collaborator in the United States told me on the phone once she threw everything she can find against the virus and nothing seemed to affect it. So it is a difficult thing to control. And I would add, for all the ivermectin people who want to think about using ivermectin, it was developed for the treatment of helminth parasites, not for COVID. It has toxic side effects. It would probably have to be used in a high dosage to get an effect on COVID, and it is entirely not recommended for use in humans.
Okay. My last question is on mixed vaccines in both the individual and in the community. So is it a good idea to mix Pfizer and AstraZeneca and or Moderna in an individual, or is it better? Also, is it good for the community to have the use of different vaccines?
Right. So first of all of the different vaccines in the end are presenting the same protein to the immune system, which is the spike protein. So it's not, the vaccines are not actually showing you something different. They're just bringing it into your body in different ways. In order to get proper herd immunity, one needs to probably get to a point where multiple different types of spike protein from the different variants are used in combination to get the maximum range of protection. Now, to get back to the question, if you start with one or the other, be it Pfizer or AstraZeneca, clearly you don't switch in the middle of when you need two vaccinations. You stay with the one you're with, because they are presenting the antigen to the immune system in different ways. The question occurs when we go down the track now, and a year or two from now, when again we need to get boosted, is it okay to switch to a different company's vaccine? That will come out in studies that will be going on over the upcoming months and years, and then recommendations will be given. At this point, I would imagine the recommendation is to stay with the company's vaccine that you're currently getting.
But safe to change if there's a contraindication to repeating the first one?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, well, we know that, because if you've had AstraZeneca and then it turned out that there was some things come up in the way of the thrombosis or whatever, you don't repeat the AstraZeneca, you go over to the Pfizer.
Yeah.
And
yes.
vice versa.
Okay.
Okay. So I can't see any more questions here that we haven't looked at. Ori, perhaps you can see some, or Michael, have you got any?
I haven't been looking. I see a total of around 80 questions. I don't know if you covered them all.
Ruth, firstly, wanted to thank you, Michael, for such an insightful presentation and really getting to all the questions, and Ruth for managing it. So what there was probably a very busy webinar, so well done to both of you. I wanted to first make a very quick announcement because we do like to end on time, and then perhaps open it up to the audience. If anyone has any particular questions and they want to ask Michael directly, they're welcome to. So just before people sign off, I wanted to let you know about another upcoming webinar that we're holding on the 12th of October. An area that's particularly close to my heart is climate change, which is obviously affecting all of us and getting more and more attention. We are holding a webinar with two distinguished CEOs. One is Davina Rooney, who is the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia, and Avner Yashar, who is the founder and owner of Yashar Architects in Israel, which is an award-winning architecture firm. They're going to talk about sustainable design and the impact of buildings on the environment. And you may or may not know, but buildings actually contribute to more than 30% of global emissions. So really, what Davina and the GBCA are doing is really driving a more sustainable and smart and environmentally conscious development. So we'll send you invitations to that. We also have a very quick survey when you log out of the webinar, which we'll appreciate your feedback. And we're going to stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes for Michael to answer questions. If anyone wants to answer directly, you can raise your hand and I'll open your microphone. Unfortunately, I haven't worked out how to include your camera, but you can definitely speak. So I see a couple of hands up and I might let them give you the opportunity to ask a question. So Diane, sorry, I just lost Diane, but I've got Peter Beaconsfield from Melbourne. Peter, the floor is yours. If you manage to unmute yourself.
Are we unmuted now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, Peter.
Good. I was just wondering what's the risk of COVID getting into the farm animals and affecting our food supply?
Right. So COVID has been shown to be able to transmit through mink, but I am not aware, and maybe it hasn't been tested, about other farm animals. I don't believe it can infect other farm animals. So I don't think that's something we have to worry about. And right now, the farm animals have problems with their own coronaviruses, and hopefully it will stay that way.
We have had one question. Can you provide a simple positioning statement that we as laymen can use to persuade anti-vaxxers of the important role we all play? Good luck with that one, Michael.
Thank you. You know, I think in all problems, such as climate change and this one, it's a highly complex problem. And it's not black and white. And I understand where anti-vaxxers are coming from. But you have to understand that this is a global village we live in, and we all have to pull together to solve this problem. What has happened, I believe, is that we've lost a lot of confidence and faith in the decision makers of this world. And we have to now take our own responsibility in the world to realize that if a large proportion of the population is not vaccinated against COVID, or worse than that, measles, we're going to see a huge spike in these diseases that are going to lead to the deaths of our loved ones. And we all want to protect our loved ones. And the way to do so is by working together and by bringing us, and by educating each other. In fact, education is probably the biggest thing of all. What I agree with is we can't use vaccines indiscriminately. We have to use them carefully. We have to learn to be strategic to solve this complex problem. It's not black and white, and not vaccinating is not a solution to the problem. It just creates a bigger problem.
Somebody suggested the analogy is refusing to black out your windows during the Blitz in London in case you fell down the stairs and hurt yourself. You have a right to leave your lights on.
Yes, and I also think people who don't want to get vaccinated should be spoken to and communicated with. They shouldn't be treated like pariahs. That is also wrong. And only through communication and education can we overcome this problem, because in the end, we're all in this together.
And just
Nicola Hebard has her hand up, so I might let her ask a question.
Ori, the lozenges are not yet commercially available.
No, they're not yet commercially available, working hard to get to that point. And they will hopefully get on the market soon as a food additive, not as a drug.
All right, Nicola, you can ask your question now.
Yes, hello, Michael.
Hello.
I read that, heard that Dr. Peter McCullough says that the vaccine can have very serious side effects, especially on people who cannot detox some of the ingredients in the vaccine. And these people are actually advised not to take it. I know people who have this, and I think it's quite a serious issue. He says there are so many side effects, people with neurological diseases, heart inflammation, myocardia, blood clots, etc., that especially not advised for people who have any indications in this direction to take the vaccine.
Yeah, I understand that. And I would say so far, based on results out of Israel and even younger children, the side effects seen are very minimal. There are some. I'm sure that Pfizer, Moderna, and the other companies are going to be working towards improving the safety profile and reduce it as much as possible, but it will never be zero. And I agree with you in specific cases where background health can interact badly with the vaccine, you have to be very careful. At the same time, again, not vaccinating population, which is the other side of the coin, also won't work. So I think, again, it's using the vaccine strategically, thinking about individuals, caring about every individual, and working out over time, what is the best vaccine to use in which individual, how often should they be vaccinated. If they've been exposed to the disease, they should be probably left alone. And I think over time, things will develop and reduce side effects that we're currently seeing.
Thank you. Odine, I don't have a surname, but the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello. I wanted to ask two questions, please. One is in regards to understanding how we get herd immunity when what I understand is that people who are vaccinated can actually be carriers, and when they're carriers, even asymptomatically, they actually were found to have as much virus in them as somebody who is sick. So how actually then a herd immunity created? Because I understand from other vaccine that, say for measles, you actually don't get sick at all and you don't carry, and then you become the buffer. But if you are a carrier, how you get herd immunity? That's question one. And question two was if you talked about lozenges, so if mouthwash motion gargling can also stop the virus at the entry points similar to lozenges.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Look, at the beginning of this pandemic, many believed you cannot achieve herd immunity against COVID-19, including Fauci. And everyone has changed their tune towards understanding it's the only way. Now, the herd immunity that is achieved is not going to be perfect. And even vaccinated people do, as you rightly say, carry virus. Usually less than non-vaccinated people, but they can transmit. So whether you're vaccinated or not, you're going to have to continue to wear a mask and socially distance and not assume that everything is now safe. Now, as immunity grows and people are still social distancing and wearing masks, you would, if you do get exposed to an infection, it should be a mild and a small dose of virus such that it doesn't cause major disease, because it is dose dependent. So if you hold down as much as you possibly can the dose, immunity will grow and develop and increase over time. And then hopefully the R value, this reproductive index, will go below 1, and the level of the peak in the wave of infection will be greatly lowered. So I do believe that is achievable. What isn't achievable is eradication. And that's something we're all going to learn over time, how good herd immunity can perform. But again, the way I see things, it's the only way to bring this pandemic under control. But it will continue. In the veterinary business, it's been going on for 80 years with ups and downs, and this will be with ups and downs. It's not going to be perfect, but I do believe if we all work together, we will achieve a situation that is quite livable. What was the second question again?
In regard to
mouthwash.
mouthwash, yes.
Yeah, so I'm in favor of mouthwashes and nasal sprays that can make make our oral and nasal cavity very difficult for the virus to thrive in. I think the problem with them, and I can't speak for the companies that make them, and I don't know them that well, is repeated use all the time may pose a problem in people because they're chemically based, etc. One of the advantages with the lozenges, it's a biological product. It's completely natural and completely safe. So I think from a safety perspective, it may have a bit of an issue, but I am in favor of using those types of things to reduce infectivity and reduce transmission.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. Ira Naot.
Hello. My question goes back to the data of COVID infections and COVID-related deaths, where you said that some of it is sketchy because a lot of the people that are, a lot of people may have been infected and were not tested.
Yes.
Is there a correlation between COVID-related deaths and total death trends? Could you see that this is actually a pandemic that's causing increases in total deaths in various countries?
Yes. I would look at, without studying that more, I would say based on what I would guess, without being 100% certain, there has been some increase in mortality overall in certain countries, but nothing yet too dramatic. And the hope is it stays that way. And as I said earlier, as bad as these waves have been, things can be a lot worse, as one saw in the Spanish flu. Of course, flu and COVID are totally different viruses. So up until now, yes, in 2020, there were 3.5 million deaths due to COVID, and that is horrendous. But on the other hand, certainly in countries where the lockdowns are a lot less traffic accidents, flu went down dramatically. So there was somewhat probably offset. So my belief is, if it's increased overall mortality, it's not a major increase, but potentially it could be one.
Thank you. Our friend Ruth McGee has a question for you, Michael.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for all that, Michael. I just wanted to know, should double vaccinated overseas visitors who have also been tested before and after flying to Australia be still quarantined, and if yes, why? Personal question.
Yes, the questions keep getting harder. From a scientific point of view, if you've been tested and vaccinated and tested, I think home quarantine is appropriate. I don't think at this stage in Australia they're going to agree to no quarantine. In Israel, by the way, if you're vaccinated and PCR tested, there's no quarantine. Is it working? I don't know. It could be better to quarantine people for a week. They were doing that for a while, and then they reduced the week to just wait for the PCR result you get from the airport. Look, I believe you're not in. The fear is that you bring in new variants into the country. I think that's the greatest fear, and you start the next wave. But on the other hand, if you don't let people in and you force them into hotel quarantine, you create a situation that we have in Australia, that the skies are closed and life is abnormal. So again, I think it's a risk analysis. There is a certain amount of risk of letting people out when they arrive at the airport and just have a PCR test, that perhaps the infection has not yet come up. They could get infected on the plane, and you'd only see a positive PCR in a number of days afterwards. So I think everyone's going to go very carefully in Australia opening up, and hopefully they'll reach a stage where it'll be much easier to travel back and forth to Australia like it is now to Israel.
Thank you.
Right. All right. Thank you, Ruth. Michael, there's a lot of questions coming through, but we do have to wrap up. So I'm gonna open the microphone to one more question. Charles Berlovitz has a question for you, and after that we will have to wrap up, unfortunately. Charles?
Thank you.
Michael, good evening. Do you have any knowledge of how the vaccine will affect the lymph glands of a human being?
I've never been asked that question before. Look, in my understanding of this vaccine, first of all, it's a minute, I'll talk about Pfizer because I don't want to get into trouble with AstraZeneca. With Pfizer, it's a minute amount of messenger RNA that's being used for the immunization. The cells that take up this message produce minute amounts of protein. The immune response is not enormous. I would expect that you will not see, and Ruth may want to jump in, and maybe you have patients that you have seen inflamed lymph nodes. I would not expect to see inflammation of the lymph node. I would expect, again, it would be fairly safe, but Ruth, maybe you have some experience as a physician with that.
Only from the vaccines we get lymph nodes, which is why they advise women not to have their mammograms for 2 months after the vaccine, because that confuses the picture.
Right. Okay.
But thankfully, you see, I cull them out. I don't see the disease.
Okay.
I have to go elsewhere. There's one more question here that I have to finish on. Should mothers continue to breastfeed until the baby can qualify for a vaccine? Now, as a great advocate of breastfeeding, I would have to say yes, but with a qualification that it depends if we're only vaccinating 12-year-olds.
Well,
Exactly.
First of all, yeah, they do plan to go down to 3-year-olds. So breastfeeding to age 3, I guess, would be very good.
But not 12.
But age 12 gets a little extreme, I agree. It's a good note to add on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. We've had some very happy comments afterwards saying, thank you, but it was all scary. And it is. Very scary.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Ori. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And we hope to see you again soon. Take care. Stay safe. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.